Throughout history, tariffs have been an abject failure. They often lead to war. The US and China could well go to war. Will it be a physical war or not? I'd like to talk to you today about a very topical subject, tariffs. Especially the tariffs being imposed on the rest of the world by the United States from the tariff king himself, self-labeled Donald Trump. So first of all, what is a tariff? Well, the tariff is really, it's a tax that gets added to the cost of goods that are imported into your country. So the US is imposing tariffs. So let's say they import cars. All cars now will pay a 25% tariff. So 25% on top of the price of the goods that are bought in the US, presumably by car companies first and then by consumers. So that 25% will be passed on. It's a tax, adds to the cost. So US consumers to buy foreign cars have to pay 25% more in the form of a tax called a tariff. Now, Trump is very keen on tariffs, but he clearly is not a man who's well read about history, because throughout history, tariffs have been an abject failure. He may have some short-term success, but the long-term failure is virtually guaranteed. Unless, to give him the benefit of the doubt, he's just using tariffs as a tool to negotiate a deal on his terms. Remember, his policy is US first, screw the rest of you. Let's just look after ourselves. I don't personally think it will work. I think other countries are far too astute to fall for this. Already there's retaliatory tariffs being imposed on America, which proves it's a zero-sum game. All that will happen as a result of tariffs is that prices will rise. That will lead to losses of jobs. It will lead to less trade, therefore worldwide recession, and it will lead to more poverty, inevitably. It just cannot succeed. It's just not a very clever policy. And if you look back in history, especially American history, you'll see that it was taxes that caused the American War of Independence, the taxes on tea that were imposed on Americans only, which is why that finally led to this American War of Independence. They were fed up being bossed around by the British and being imposed high taxes. That was back in 1775. But what most people don't recall or know about is that there was a further war between Britain and the US in 1815 that lasted for 3 years, but that was specifically about tariffs. So clearly these taxes are a terrible thing, not only in terms of affecting the global trade badly, but also they often lead to war, which is quite scary when you think that there's a trade war between China and the US. And throughout history, whenever there's been a change in the dominant country of the world, there's always been a war, which is a warning sign here that the US and China could well go to war. Will it be a physical war or not? I don't know. I personally suspect it's more likely to be a war of trade, a war of technology, that kind of war. Or if there is a physical war, more likely to be a war of robots and drones, etc., is my personal view. Let's hope it only comes to that, if at all. It may just be restricted to trade wars in future, geopolitical wars, which arguably already is. That's my view. So tariffs, not a good idea. They've never worked. They never will. If Trump persists with this policy, I think it's going to be an abject failure. And what will happen is that countries like China will be far too smart to fall for this. They're already planning very clever ways to get around this. One of the things they did the last time around when Trump was in power, they diverted their exports through other countries, typically Southeast Asian countries, but not solely. And then the exports come from those countries that are suffering lower tariffs. So they're not labelled Chinese exports, for example. That's one way of doing it. But the other thing that China's been very, very clever about doing for many years now is creating their own domestic market. They don't intend to be forever an exporting country. They've succeeded a lot in the last 40 years exporting to wealthy countries like America. But America's a country of just 300 million people. China's a country of 1.4 billion. They have already successfully moved hundreds of millions of people from an agricultural sector, agricultural employment, into the cities. And when you move a Chinese person from the fields in agriculture and put them in the city, their earnings increase by 20 times. 20 times. So what does that mean? it means they're creating their own domestic economy. And okay, the amount of income they earn per capita is not as high as the US, but it's catching up, and it will catch up eventually. China will be the most dominant country in the world economically. They arguably already are. And when that happens, they can replace the entire US population. If there's 300 million people in America, how long would it take China to move another 300 million people out of agriculture into the cities and increase their income 20-fold? Hey, presto, they've got their own domestic market. So all that America's doing is accelerating the trade from China to their own people and excluding the US altogether. So I think they're too smart. Also, the Chinese do have historically and still have this thing called the Silk Road, where the trade flows literally from east to west, from China via Turkey into Europe. That's always been a very successful trade route for them. They still have that. But also they're very cleverly building this, what's known as a belt road. And this is different. This is where they are investing in ports in third world countries, where they're able to offer to build infrastructure, ports, motorways, warehouses, etc., in these poorer countries. And they offer to lend the money knowing that these countries can't afford it. So what happens after a while? After a few years, the countries run out of money, and the forfeiture clause is they have to gift those assets to the Chinese government. So what can the Chinese government then do? They can dominate trade in all these third world countries. So they've got very cheap sources of labour and cheap markets they can sell to as those countries become wealthier over the years, as they inevitably will do eventually. Now, where did they get that idea from to build this infrastructure in these other countries? Well, they borrowed it from the United States. That's been their policy, as was explained in this famous book called The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And what it proved was that in America, what they did, the way they took over the world, was they used something called corporatism. Basically, it was the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, that was behind it all, but they covered up the government involvement by getting companies to go to these third world countries to speak to the dictator, usually a dictator, and explain to them that if they didn't allow the American engineers and builders to construct all this infrastructure, then they would lose their position as head of the country. And when I say lose their position, it didn't mean they were just demoted and replaced. Number of times these leaders mysteriously died in accidents in helicopters on numerous occasions. I mean, I'll leave you to make your own conclusion what happened there. But that was the way that they did it, through companies, by forcing the infrastructure to be built by Americans, by their engineers and their constructors. And China is doing something very similar with this Belt Road. So that's how they learned it, and that's how they're going to continue to dominate. So I think it's too little too late what Trump's doing. I think he's got a very simplistic notion that this is going to help the United States. Personally, I think it will lead the country into decline at a much more rapid pace than would otherwise have happened. So over to you what you think, guys, but that's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it.